Iron, as we know it, is a bit of a drama queen. It can't handle air, or moisture, or frankly, existing. Give it half a chance, and it'll turn itself into a reddish-brown powder out of sheer self-pity. But somehow, medieval iron didn't. For centuries, people have marveled at how certain medieval gates, church hinges, and weapons have survived, stubbornly intact, while our modern tools quietly corrode in their packaging. There's a little irony in that. We have satellites and space-age alloys, and yet a 12th century monk's door hinge looks better than your car's muffler. So tonight, we're going to explore why. Why the iron of the Middle Ages, blacksmith forged by candlelight, hammered on stones, cooled by intuition, seems immune to time. Let's start, gently, where all good iron begins, with dirt. The secret in the soil. Medieval iron started as something humbler than we imagine, bog iron. Not dug from grand mountain mines, but scooped, patiently, from wetlands. Bog iron formed naturally in the shallow waters of Europe's marshes. It regenerated slowly, like an organic crop, which meant you could return every decade to harvest it again. The process was slow, sustainable, and slightly swampy. In other words, perfect for medieval life. Bog iron was rich in impurities, manganese, phosphorus, silica, even traces of organic matter. Modern metallurgy sees impurities as flaws. Medieval blacksmiths saw them as flavor. Those trace elements, as it turns out, were the key. Phosphorus, for example, helped make the surface of the iron resistant to oxidation. It gave the metal a dense, glassy texture that rust couldn't penetrate easily. So while your modern stainless steel relies on chromium and science, their rust-proof iron relied on mud. Fire the bloomery, where alchemy happened. Now, imagine a blacksmith's workshop in the year 1200. There's no electricity. No temperature gauge. Just a man, a hammer, and a roaring bloomery furnace, a clay tower glowing orange in the night. This wasn't a melting process. Medieval furnaces couldn't reach the 1538 degrees Celsius needed to liquefy iron. Instead, they coaxed the ore into a semi-solid sponge, called a bloom. Inside that bloom, every piece of iron was unique, some bits hard, others soft, some layered with carbon, others with slag. A blacksmith would pull this glowing lump from the fire, hammer it endlessly, and fold it like bread dough to drive out impurities. That rhythmic striking wasn't just theater, it welded microscopic layers together, creating alternating bands of metal and slag. Those thin slag veins, rich in silica and phosphorus, acted as natural sealants. Over time, they self-healed. So when oxygen or moisture tried to creep in, those slag layers blocked it, forming a microscopic barrier that modern alloys struggle to imitate. It was messy metallurgy. But it worked. And somehow, it worked better than our industrial precision. Crossed swords medieval chemistry, the accidental science. The thing about medieval technology is that much of it wasn't intentional. Blacksmiths didn't know why their iron resisted rust. They just knew that this particular bog made better metal than that particular mountain. It was a world ruled by feel. A touch of superstition. A whisper of science. Blacksmiths described iron as alive. You didn't forge it, you coaxed it. You kept it at just the right color, not orange, not yellow, but that secret shade of dragon's breath red. The best smiths could tell temperature by watching the sparks. The slow, bright ones meant high carbon content. The fast, sharp ones? Too brittle. They didn't have chemistry. They had intuition. And occasionally, superstition helped. They believed bog iron had grown under the influence of the moon. That it was a kind of living earth gift. And they treated it accordingly, never mixing ores from rival regions, never smelting during storms, and never speaking ill of the iron while it was heating. A little mystical? Sure. But perhaps part of its endurance lay in that careful reverence. Mantelpiece clock iron that outlived its makers. Let's drift for a moment to the Iron Pillar of Delhi, forged around 400 CE, and still standing, rust-free, after more than 1,600 years. Though not European, it embodies the same secret, phosphorus-rich wrought iron. the kind medieval Europe later rediscovered, largely by accident. In Northern Europe, the bog iron tradition flourished. From Scandinavia to Saxony, rural blacksmiths pulled their ore from swamps, not mines. The results were consistent, dark, dense, enduring metal. If you visit a medieval church today, say, the Cathedral of Exeter or a small stone chapel in Denmark, you might find hinges, nails, and locks that are over 800 years old. Their surface will look rough, almost pitted, but still strong. That thin black patina? It's not decay. It's protection. As the iron aged, it developed a stable layer of magnetite, Fe3O4, which sealed the metal underneath. Instead of flaking away like modern rust, it formed a kind of armor, tight, dark, and noble. Modern steel rusts because its protective layer breaks apart. Medieval iron endures because its rust became a skin. A poetic sort of immortality. Castle the ironwork of the cathedrals. When you look at the great Gothic cathedrals of France, Chartres, Amiens, Notre Dame, your eyes go to the stained glass, the stone carvings, the arches that defy gravity. But holding those vast creations together were miles of hidden iron. Rods, clamps, pins, hinges, and tie bars, all hand-forged, each slightly different. And remarkably, many still hold. When restorers disassembled parts of Notre Dame after the 2019 fire, they found 12th century iron bars still intact. Charred, yes, but not eaten by rust. That's a millennium of Paris rain, bird droppings, candle smoke, and yet the metal refused to yield. There's a certain quiet triumph in that. The anonymous blacksmiths, men whose names were never recorded, outlasted every monarch who ever taxed them. Brick meanwhile, in the modern age. Fast forward to today. We can make iron purer than ever. We can align its atoms, temper it, treat it, and sell it in 48 hours. And yet, your garden chair from last summer looks like an archaeological find. Why? Because pure isn't always better. Our industrial process removes everything, the phosphorus, the slag, the impurities that once made medieval iron self-protecting. Modern steel is uniform, clean, and highly reactive. It's strong, but unshielded. Unless you coat it with paint, zinc, or plastic, it begins to weep orange tears. It's the difference between a hand-baked loaf of bread and a supermarket bun. One goes stale fast. The other ages beautifully. Gear the philosophy of endurance. There's something quietly philosophical about it. Medieval iron endures not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. Its flaws protected it. Its impurities gave it strength. There's a lesson there about the strange durability of imperfection. The world of modern metals is obsessed with control, precision, elimination. The medieval world, meanwhile, worked with what it had, and found resilience in its roughness. Their iron wasn't pure, but it was alive. It changed slowly with time, rather than resisting it. Perhaps that's why it's still here. A hinge that remembers the Middle Ages while your car door forgets last winter. End arrow gently fading out. So next time you see a piece of medieval ironwork on a cathedral gate or a castle door, remember, it's not luck that kept it alive. It's chemistry. It's craftsmanship. And it's 1,000 quiet hammer strikes echoing through the centuries. The rust-proof miracle wasn't a secret formula. It was patience, fire, and a willingness to let imperfection do its work. And maybe, as you drift off tonight, you can take comfort in that thought. That the things built with care and a touch of impurity often last the longest. Candle, thanks for drifting through history with me tonight. If you'd like more quiet tales of strange, forgotten brilliance, subscribe, or just stay cozy right here. There's plenty more to wander through, one sleepy century at a time. Hey there again, still awake? Good. Let's stay in the gentle orange glow of the forge for a while longer. The air's warm, heavy with charcoal and the hum of something ancient. Tonight, we're not chasing kings or wars, but the quiet men who shaped metal, and by accident, shaped civilization. So, pull the blanket a little tighter, and let's drift softly into the clang and calm of the medieval forge. Hammer the blacksmith, Europe's unofficial sorcerer. In medieval villages, the blacksmith was a paradox. He was essential and slightly feared. To the average peasant, he seemed part magician, part engineer, part pyromaniac. He could take a lump of lifeless rock, feed it to a fire, whisper to it with a hammer, and somehow, out came a horseshoe, a plowshare, or a sword. No one really understood how. And because medieval people loved a little superstition with their science, they assumed the smith had help. There were whispers of pacts with infernal forces. After all, he worked with fire that couldn't be tamed, metal that glowed like the sun, and tools that defied nature. In many villages, his forge stood just outside the church, but not too close. Close enough to bless the work. Far enough that the priest didn't have to see what else might be happening in there. It was said the ringing of the hammer scared away evil spirits. Or possibly, annoyed them enough to leave. Either way, the blacksmith became a figure of mystery. Half craftsman, half philosopher. And every nail, hinge, or sword that came from his hand carried a bit of that aura. Candle firelight and faith. Let's drift into the workshop itself. It's night. Always night in the stories. The forge glows in the corner like a heartbeat. Sparks rise and vanish into the rafters. The smith's hands are blackened, his tunic singed, and his eyes, half blinded by years of heat, still watch the metal's color like it's talking back. He doesn't measure by degrees. He measures by feeling. Too pale, and the iron sulks. Too bright, and it burns. There's a rhythm to it. The slow breath between hammer strikes. The hiss when water hits the steel. The faint smell of sulfur and smoke. You can almost hear the medieval lullaby of it, clang, hiss, breath, repeat. And somewhere in that rhythm, the impossible happens. Raw ore becomes art. Crossed swords forging beauty, function first, ornament later. To the modern eye, medieval metalwork looks decorative, curving scrolls, delicate hinges, spiraled handles, latticework locks. But beauty wasn't the point. Durability was. And yet, through some wonderful alchemy of human pride, function always invited ornament. If a smith could make a hinge that worked, he might as well make it beautiful. So we got cathedral doors covered in scrolling vines of iron. Gates shaped like blooming roses. Locks engraved with prayers or curses, depending on the neighborhood. It wasn't mass production, it was personality in metal. Each blacksmith left his quiet signature, often hidden. A tiny mark beneath the hinge plate, or a symbol etched inside the lock. Not a logo. A whisper, I was here. I made this. And centuries later, those whispers remain, outlasting every name carved in stone. Gear the technique they couldn't explain. The medieval blacksmith's secret weapon was experience, generational, inherited, and undocumented. They didn't write down their recipes. They remembered them, through apprenticeships that lasted half a lifetime. A boy might start at age 7, sweeping ash and bellows dust. By the time he was 30, he could look at a glowing metal bar and know exactly when it was ready. Not because of math. Because of muscle memory, smoke, and instinct. When he finally became a master, he passed those instincts to his apprentice in the same wordless way, through repetition. That's why the art was so fragile. One broken line of teaching, one plague, one war, and centuries of expertise vanished overnight. There are entire techniques, folding patterns, hardening rituals, color treatments, that we still can't replicate, because the people who knew didn't know they knew. They just did it. And then they died. It's a strangely medieval kind of tragedy. Not with swords and banners, but with silence. Fire, iron, and the human spirit. There's something very human about the way medieval iron was made. It started dirty. It took forever. It demanded care. And when it was done, it wasn't flawless, but it was alive. The blacksmiths themselves often wrote poems, rough, uneven verses scratched into lead sheets or carved on walls. One anonymous smith from 14th century France wrote, "I make from fire the things that last. though I am made of ash and dust." Simple words, but they carry the weight of the forge, its humility, its heat, its quiet pride. The work was brutal. Many blacksmiths went half-blind by 40. Their lungs filled with soot. Their hands shook from the endless hammering. But they built the skeleton of the medieval world. Everything that moved, horses, carts, mills, weapons, doors, did so because a blacksmith made it possible. You could lose a king, and the world went on. Lose a blacksmith, and the world stopped. Chains, bells, and secret ingenuities. Some of their finest work hides in plain sight. Take the iron chains that hold cathedral roofs in place. They're centuries old, buried deep within stone walls, quietly bearing the weight of entire buildings. Or the massive church bells, each one a marvel of balance, tuned not by machines but by the ear of a half-deaf craftsman. They didn't calculate vibration patterns, they listened. When you hear a medieval bell ring today, you're hearing math that was done by instinct. And perhaps my favorite. Blacksmiths also crafted automata, simple mechanical toys, saints that nodded, birds that flapped their wings when the church door opened. Tiny miracles of movement. Because even back then, people loved a good gadget. Compass, the lost language of iron. Over time, the Industrial Revolution replaced all of this. The rhythm of the hammer became the hum of machines. Production sped up. Output soared. And something, quiet, unmeasured, was lost. Modern forges are precise. But they don't hum the same way. There's no patience, no superstition, no whispered apology to the metal before striking. The blacksmith's world vanished into efficiency. But traces remain, in wrought iron gates that have outlived empires, in museum locks that still turn smoothly, in swords that ring faintly like tuning forks when tapped. Those echoes are the ghosts of their craft. They remind us that beauty once emerged not from control, but from rhythm. Waxen crescent moon, a soft ending. So as we drift out of the forge tonight, let the glow fade slowly. The last sparks float upward. The hammer rests. The iron cools. In the quiet, you can almost hear it, the echo of centuries of creation. Ordinary men, sweating and half-blind, shaping permanence from chaos. They didn't know they were preserving history. They were just doing their work. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the most enduring things are made by people who never intended to be remembered. Studio microphone, thanks for staying in the forge with me tonight. If you enjoyed this slow wander through smoke, sparks, and centuries, feel free to subscribe or drift along to the next story. We'll keep exploring the quiet corners of history, one sleepy hammer strike at a time. Hey everyone, still with me? Good. Tonight, we're leaving the forge and stepping into a room full of glass flasks, bubbling potions, and men who very sincerely believed they could turn sadness, and also lead, into gold. So, dim the lamps, breathe a little slower, and let's drift into the age of medieval alchemy, where science and wishful thinking shared the same desk. Test tube, the dream that refused to die. Alchemy is often remembered as a failure. A quaint prelude to chemistry. A centuries-long attempt to turn base metals into gold that, rather predictably, didn't work. But that's not quite fair. Alchemy was less about gold, and more about hope. It was the idea that matter, like people, could be perfected. That everything impure could, with patience and fire, become eternal. That's not science. That's faith with better lighting. And in the flickering medieval laboratory, it looked almost believable. Glass vessels glowed with strange colors. Liquids hissed and steamed. Metal changed shape, shimmered, hardened. And just for a moment, the alchemist could imagine he was watching the universe rewrite itself. Fire from blacksmiths to alchemists. It's no coincidence that the first alchemists were often blacksmiths or metalworkers. They already understood transformation. They'd watched dull stones bloom into steel. They knew that heat could change everything. Alchemy was simply curiosity turned spiritual. Why did fire purify metal? Why did some ores yield gold and others nothing? Could the same process, refinement through flame, apply to the human soul? And if perfection existed in nature, why shouldn't they be able to make it themselves? Of course, in true medieval fashion, they made it weird. They didn't separate science from spirituality. Their laboratories doubled as prayer rooms. Their recipes included equal parts mercury and morality. It wasn't enough to heat the metal. You had to purify yourself while doing it. Which, to be fair, probably made the whole gold-making process take a bit longer. Crescent Moon, the Philosopher's Stone. The centerpiece of all this glowing madness was the Philosopher's Stone. And no, not the one with wizards and owls. The real version, older, stranger, and somehow even less practical. To medieval minds, the stone was the key to everything. It could transmute lead into gold, heal sickness, grant immortality. It was perfection, crystallized. Naturally, everyone wanted one. From monks in Paris to nobles in Prague, entire fortunes were poured into labs chasing the elusive stone. Some claimed to have found it. Others faked it. And a few, admirably, just went mad in style trying. The stone never existed, of course, but the search left behind something even more valuable, the roots of modern chemistry. Because every failed attempt taught them a little more about heat, metal, and reaction. Failure, in the end, was progress wearing a medieval hat. Petri dish, strange ingredients and stranger beliefs. Medieval alchemists had what you might call creative confidence. Their ingredient lists were spectacularly questionable. They mixed mercury, lead, salt, vinegar, blood, and sometimes, yes, urine. They were convinced the world's secrets were hidden in the ordinary. That enlightenment could be boiled out of everyday filth. Which, in its own poetic way, feels accurate. The guiding principle of alchemy was that like creates like. Gold was pure and eternal, so anything that shimmered, glowed, or endured was a clue to its nature. They saw connections where we see coincidence. The sun corresponded to gold, the moon to silver, Mars to iron. Everything had meaning, even if the meaning wasn't especially helpful. It was a worldview full of patterns, and comfortingly absurd logic. Amphora, the alchemist's workshop. Picture it for a moment. A stone room in a crumbling castle. Shelves lined with powders and glass jars labeled in Latin, half of them misspelled. A furnace glows faintly in the corner, fueled by wood and wishful thinking. An alchemist in a singed robe leans over a bubbling crucible. He mutters prayers, or equations, no one can tell the difference. The air smells like sulfur and failure. But in his mind, he's standing on the brink of creation. Any moment now, he thinks, the dull gray lead will shine. He's wrong, of course. But he'll try again tomorrow. And maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Because while the nobles demanded gold, the alchemists quietly invented things like acids, distillation, and laboratory glassware, tools that would one day make actual chemistry possible. In chasing perfection, they built the future. Chains the iron connection. It's easy to forget, but alchemy's obsession with transmutation had a practical side, too. Medieval craftsmen noticed that certain metals changed in the forge. Iron hardened when quenched in water or oil. Copper alloys gleamed differently when mixed with tin or zinc. To them, this was transformation, proof that matter could be coaxed to evolve. If one kind of metal could become stronger or brighter, why not believe that lead might, with the right persuasion, become gold? It wasn't nonsense. It was pattern recognition gone romantic. The same hands that forged unrusting iron also stirred cauldrons of mercury and dreamed of eternity. They weren't trying to get rich. They were trying to understand why some things endured, and others decayed. That's the quiet, unspoken heart of medieval alchemy. A desperate wish to stop time. Scroll the church, the crown, and the quiet rebellion. Of course, not everyone appreciated these experiments. The church worried that alchemists were meddling in divine creation. The crown worried they might actually succeed, and collapse the economy. So alchemy lived in the shadows. Half tolerated, half hunted. Some kings secretly funded alchemists, hoping to strike literal gold. Others jailed them as frauds when their patience, or treasury, ran out. One poor soul, an English alchemist named George Ripley, claimed his elixir worked, but he was forced to give it all to the Knights Hospitaller, who immediately spent it on fortifications. Which, if you're wondering, did not help the experiment. But somehow, through all the suspicion and superstition, the practice survived, passed in coded manuscripts, disguised as poetry, sometimes even hidden in church art. It became less a science, and more a language of symbols. A way to talk about perfection, transformation, and mortality without getting burned at the stake. Balance scale, the subtle victory of failure. When we look back, it's tempting to laugh at alchemists. To picture old men stirring pots of mercury, muttering about immortality. But their failures are the reason your medicine cabinet, your car battery, and your smartphone exist. They built the vocabulary of chemistry, the idea that elements react, combine, and evolve. They didn't find eternal life. But they did find sulfuric acid. Which, admittedly, lasts quite a while. And beneath all the strange symbols and smoky rooms, there's a strangely touching persistence. They believed the world could be perfected. And they kept trying, long after reason said stop. Which makes alchemy less of a mistake, and more of a lullaby to human stubbornness. Waxing crescent moon drifting to the end. So as we close the door on the alchemist's workshop tonight, let's leave him there, bathed in gold light, hopeful, and probably coughing slightly from the fumes. He never found the philosopher's stone. But in chasing it, he discovered something more enduring, the idea that curiosity itself might be sacred. Every failed transmutation, every melted crucible, every illusion of progress was still progress, quietly dragging humanity toward understanding. And maybe, in some small way, that was the real transformation all along. Studio microphone, thanks for wandering through the strange glow of medieval alchemy with me tonight. If you enjoyed this slow burn through mystery and molten metal, feel free to stay for the next one. We'll drift into the quieter corners of forgotten history again soon. Until then, sleep well, and dream in gold. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're wandering into the glittering halls of Royal Europe, rooms lined with gold, silver, and just enough poison to make a modern chemist cry. So, if you've ever looked at a royal portrait and thought, he doesn't look well, you're right. The crowns, the plates, the walls, all of it was slowly killing them. Let's drift through that beautiful, toxic world, one quietly doomed monarch at a time. Crown the price of shine. For centuries, European royalty surrounded themselves with metal. Gold for crowns. Silver for plates. Pewter for goblets. Even lead for paint, makeup, and architectural decoration. Everything glittered, and almost everything was poisonous. But vanity is a powerful force. If your palace didn't sparkle, were you even really divine? They didn't know, of course. The words lead poisoning didn't exist yet. They just thought fainting, madness, and spontaneous organ failure were part of royal life. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Skull lead, the silent courtier. Let's start with the quietest killer of them all, lead. It was everywhere. Pipes, goblets, cosmetics, paint, even medicine. The Romans had started the trend, flavoring their wine with sapa, a syrup boiled in lead pots. It made it sweet and deadly. Medieval and Renaissance Europe politely continued the tradition. Royal kitchens used lead-glazed ceramics. Court physicians prescribed lead compounds as tonics. And ladies of the court painted their faces with a thick white paste of vinegar and lead carbonate. The result was that most of the royal court glowed, literally. Smooth, pale, luminous skin, and a high probability of neurological decay. You can almost imagine the compliments. "Oh, Your Majesty, you're radiant." "Yes," he replies, "and possibly dying." Cough in the leaded lineage. One of the most tragic victims was Queen Elizabeth I. Her signature white complexion, the mask of youth, was made from Venetian ceruse, the finest and deadliest makeup of its kind. The longer she wore it, the more her skin blistered, scarred, and demanded thicker layers to hide it. By her later years, she was trapped in a cycle of beauty and poison, covering the wounds caused by the cure. It's almost poetic. She ruled an empire but couldn't escape her mirror. And she wasn't alone. Across Europe, noble women fainted at balls, coughed blood into lace handkerchiefs, and blamed it all on weak constitutions. Which was true, if by constitution you meant bone marrow slowly dissolving. Classical building poison in the palace. Lead was elegant in its deception, odorless, tasteless, everywhere. But it wasn't the only metallic mischief in the royal bloodstream. Mercury made a strong showing. Used in medicines, gilding, and, because of course it was, early cosmetics. The French court adored mercury-based skin creams. They called it the silver mirror. Which, in fairness, was accurate. It polished you from the outside and hollowed you from the inside. King Charles II of England took mercury cures for his constant illnesses. When he finally died in 1685, his autopsy read like a chemical inventory: mercury in the brain, lead in the liver, and silver in the bones. He had, in the truest sense, died as he lived, a man of metals. Gemstone, the gilded illness. The irony is that these poisons were symbols of purity. White lead makeup meant cleanliness. Gold meant divine favor. Silver meant purity of spirit. But the brighter the court shone, the faster it decayed. Many royal portraits from the 16th to 18th centuries depict monarchs with strangely pale, puffy faces, not artistic flattery, but realism. Those faint eyes, trembling lips, the slightly vacant stare, those weren't signs of serenity. They were symptoms. When doctors were called, usually too late, they prescribed more metals. Feeling ill, Majesty? Here, drink this tincture of mercury. And the court applauded. Medicine, fashion, and poison, all indistinguishable. Gear the leaded palace. Even the walls turned against them. Royal palaces across Europe used lead-based paints and gold leaf bound with arsenic glazes. Architects loved lead because it was soft and easy to shape, perfect for roofs, gutters, and ornaments. Unfortunately, rainwater washed it into the wells. And the servants drank it first. So, the royal household glittered with wealth above, and quietly corroded below. If you've ever wondered why so many royal lineages were plagued with mystery illnesses, miscarriages, and bouts of melancholy, well, the answer was trickling from the ceiling. Lotion bottle perfume, poison, and pearls. Then there was the jewelry, not toxic in itself, but made worse by the strange substances used to clean it. To polish pearls, royal attendants used aqua fortis, nitric acid. To brighten silver, they rubbed it with mercury paste. To gild objects, they heated gold mercury amalgam until the mercury evaporated, right into the air they breathed. Palace workshops became miniature gas chambers of affluence. Apprentices lost teeth. Servants went blind. And the royals inhaled their wealth in invisible doses. All so that every goblet and frame could catch the candlelight just a little better. There's something morbidly fitting about that. Burning for beauty, literally. Alembic, the science they missed. The tragedy is that they were so close to understanding. Alchemists had already guessed that metals had spirits, volatile essences that could harm or heal. They were wrong about the magic, but right about the danger. It took until the 18th century for chemists to name and isolate toxins like lead oxide and mercury vapor. By then, generations of nobility had quietly disintegrated from the inside. When modern researchers analyzed the remains of royal families, from the Habsburgs to the Tudors, they found absurdly high concentrations of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Their grandeur had quite literally become their decay. It's hard not to admire the symmetry. DNA, the curse of blue blood. The phrase blue blood wasn't just about noble lineage, it might also have been visual. Lead poisoning gives skin a pale blue hue in veins that stand out faintly under the surface. So when the courtiers called themselves Sangre Azul, they were half right. They were noble, yes, and mildly contaminated. Their fragility became fashionable. A fainting noblewoman was delicate. A coughing prince was tragic. An unsteady monarch was pious. They didn't see sickness as decay, they saw it as refinement. It was, in its own way, the ultimate royal irony. Broken heart death by design. By the late Renaissance, the symptoms were everywhere. Catherine de' Medici's court suffered mysterious bouts of infertility and madness. The Habsburgs developed jaw deformities worsened by malnutrition and toxicity. Even Napoleon, much later, showed arsenic traces in his hair, likely from the green pigment of his wallpaper. Europe's rulers had built palaces that gleamed by candlelight and exhaled poison by dawn. No curses. No conspiracies. Just bad chemistry and expensive taste. Candle the elegance of decay. So as you picture the grandeur of those royal halls, chandeliers sparkling, gold glinting on every surface, imagine the faint shimmer in the air wasn't just dust. It was mercury. It was lead. It was wealth, slowly killing the people who wore it. Their crowns corroded their scalps. Their goblets poisoned their wine. Their beauty made them brittle. And all of it, somehow, looked exquisite. Waxing crescent moon a gentle close. Maybe that's the strange lesson of it all. That luxury has a half-life. That the more a civilization worships its shine, the faster it rusts beneath. The medieval blacksmiths built iron that outlasted centuries. The royals built palaces that gleamed for a lifetime and took their lives with them. So next time you see a crown behind museum glass, try not to envy it too much. It was beautiful, yes. But it was also a slow, glittering curse. Studio microphone, thank you for wandering through this quiet, toxic chapter of royal history with me. If you'd like to keep drifting through stories where beauty meets decay, stay close. There's always another tale waiting, soft as dust, and just a little poisonous. Welcome back, traveler of tired minds. If you've made it this far, through the fires, the forges, and the poisons of history, then rest easy. This is the last stretch. Tonight, we end not with gold or blood, but with iron, the quiet heart of the medieval world. Not beautiful, perhaps, but eternal. The metal that built cathedrals, broke kingdoms, and still hums beneath our cities today. Let's drift into that iron dream, steady, strong, and slightly rusted. Nut and bolt, the age of iron and prayer. By the late Middle Ages, iron had become more than a tool. It was the skeleton of faith. Cathedrals like Notre Dame, Chartres, and Cologne weren't just feats of stone, they were held together with invisible webs of forged iron. Massive rods and clamps locked arches in place, hammered and fitted by hand in the cold light of dawn. Each cathedral, in a way, was a kind of iron cage for heaven. And though the prayers of its builders have long faded, the metal still holds. When restorers peel back the stone centuries later, they find the same dark lines of iron, almost untouched by time. It has outlived empires, kings, and every craftsman who ever touched it. It's hard not to admire that kind of faith, one that leaves behind proof in rust. Castle iron and empire. But iron wasn't only for heaven. It also forged conquest. From the simple blacksmith's hammer to the thunder of cannons, iron became the sound of authority. By the 14th century, European warfare had turned from chivalric to industrial, armor grew heavier, weapons larger, and every castle wall began to tremble at the echo of gunpowder. The bombards, vast cannons like Mons Meg in Scotland, were made from dozens of iron staves bound by hoops and bands. They were the medieval world's first machines of mass terror. But even here, there was beauty. Each cannon bore engraving, scrollwork, even prayers, as though its builders feared the soul of the weapon might rebel. It's strangely human, that impulse to decorate destruction. Gear the smith's legacy. Iron defined the medieval craftsman more than any guild or banner. The blacksmith was both magician and mechanic, the man who could pull shape from chaos. Every village had one. Every lord depended on one. And while kings came and went, the smith's fire never truly died. In fact, many medieval blacksmith forges became the foundation of modern industry. The same sites that once shaped swords later built locomotives and bridges. That rhythmic clang, hammer, bellows, hammer, is, in a way, the heartbeat of civilization itself. You can still hear it in every construction site, every engine plant, every train yard. We just gave it new tools to work with. Fire cathedrals of smoke. As the centuries turned, the forge moved from churchyards to city edges, from sacred duty to profit. The Industrial Revolution didn't appear overnight, it was the natural child of 1,000 years of medieval metallurgy. Those smoky towns of northern England and the Rhineland, with their endless ironworks, were, in essence, the afterlife of the blacksmith's art. The medieval smiths dreamed of perfect metal. The Victorians achieved it, in steel. But something went missing along the way: the ritual, the reverence, the sound of the craftsman whispering a prayer before striking the first blow. Iron had gone from sacred to mechanical. Useful, yes, but no longer alive. Chains the rust that doesn't sleep. Iron's only flaw is that it remembers air too well. Exposed to water and time, it rusts, that reddish ghost creeping across its surface like a slow sigh. And yet, even rust tells a story. Every flake is a timeline, every scar a record of touch, of rain, of time. That's why historians love it, because iron never really dies, it just ages differently. Even weapons buried for 1,000 years can be coaxed back into shape, their surfaces whispering of forgotten wars and lost hands. There's a kind of humility in that. Gold survives untouched, arrogant. Iron survives imperfect, honest. Maybe that's why it feels more human. Candle the eternal craft. In the great vaults of European cathedrals today, conservationists still polish the same iron bolts forged before Columbus ever sailed. They keep the stone in place, unseen, patient, loyal. It's a quiet kind of immortality. The kind that doesn't demand worship, only endurance. Iron has outlasted kings, wars, religions, and revolutions. It will probably outlast us, too. And when the last skyscraper falls silent someday, the iron within it will still hum faintly, remembering the forge, the hammer, the hand. That's the legacy of the medieval smith. Not wealth, not fame, but permanence. Waxing crescent moon, the last glow of the forge. So now, as we close this long, molten journey, from the fire that birthed the first blade to the crowns that corroded their wearers, it's worth pausing. History, like iron, is forged by pressure and heat. And while time may rust its edges, the shape remains. The swords are gone. The forges are cold. But the metal and the memory remain, humming softly beneath the centuries. So rest easy, traveler. The fire is out. The iron sleeps. Studio microphone, thank you for wandering through these forgotten furnaces of time with me. If you enjoyed this quiet descent into the age of iron, subscribe or follow to drift deeper into the strange, sleepy corners of history, where even the rust tells a story. Until next time, sleep well, and dream in iron. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the world was louder in the wrong ways. No traffic, no buzzing phones, just the faint scratching of rats behind the walls and the occasional scream from someone who had just discovered what that sound actually was. So, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Because tonight we're exploring the strange, surprisingly prestigious, and often tragic little world of the medieval rat catcher. Yes, that was a real job. And no, it didn't pay nearly enough. Candles setting the scene. Imagine a medieval street after dark. The lamps, what few existed, are out. The air smells faintly of smoke, spoiled grain, and regret. A narrow alley twists between timbered houses, their walls leaning inward as if eavesdropping. Somewhere in the dark, something squeaks. And then scurries. That, right there, is job security. Because in medieval Europe, if you heard that sound, you didn't call an exterminator, you called a rat catcher. Usually a man. Occasionally a woman. Always someone slightly odd. Someone who could crawl into places no one else wanted to, handle things no one else dared touch, and walk away with a pouch full of wriggling profit. And if they were really good, they might even live to do it again tomorrow. Basket the rat problem that never ended. Rats weren't just a nuisance. They were a fact of life. They lived in barns, taverns, granaries, ships, castles, and, if you were especially unlucky, your bed. They ate grain, chewed through walls, and multiplied faster than medieval record keepers could count. And for centuries, no one quite understood how they spread disease. People blamed bad air, divine punishment, or possibly the neighbor's suspiciously healthy cat. But the truth was small, furry, and carried in its blood a disaster waiting to happen. By the time the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, rats had already been thriving for generations. The fleas they carried did the rest. Still, medieval people didn't hate rats the way we might assume. They were annoying, yes, but also expected. Like taxes, or the French. The rat catcher's toolkit. So how did one become a professional rat hunter? Step 1, a complete lack of self-preservation. Step 2, a bag. Step 3, questionable ethics and a good whistle. Rat catchers carried all sorts of ingenious tools: nets, tongs, small dogs, ferrets, and cages baited with cheese, grain, or occasionally, a dead rat. Yes, that's right. Rats were weirdly sentimental. They'd come running toward the scent of one of their own. Which says something about their social lives. A skilled rat catcher might even keep a few trained rats as decoys. It's not clear how you train a rat, but given enough crumbs and trauma, they probably complied. Some catchers smeared honey or tar on their traps to make rodents stick. Others relied on dogs, usually terriers bred for hunting small creatures with unhealthy enthusiasm. The bravest, though, did it by hand. Imagine that. Crawling through a cellar, in the dark, grabbing squirming bundles of fur and teeth with bare fingers. All for a few coins. And occasionally, a case of the plague. A questionable reputation. The life of a rat catcher was complicated. They were essential, but also avoided. People needed them, but didn't really want to see them. They smelled like their work. They handled death, disease, and filth for a living. Which made them both useful and vaguely unholy. The same people who paid them might also refuse to share a table with them. Or accuse them of witchcraft, because anyone who could control vermin must be in league with something unpleasant. In Germany, a few even became folk heroes, half sorcerer, half saint. You might know the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a brightly dressed rat catcher who, after being underpaid, took a rather dark approach to debt collection. In the real world, the job wasn't quite that theatrical. No music, no magic flute. Just one exhausted man with a stick and a bag, trying to stay ahead of the next infestation. Cough-in the plague years. When the Black Death arrived, rat catchers suddenly found themselves in grim demand. They couldn't cure anything, but they looked like they could help. And when half your village is coughing blood, anyone with a solution, no matter how unsanitary, seems like a good idea. Some tried fumigation, burning herbs and sulfur to chase away bad air. Others brought cats by the dozen. A few just set the whole building on fire and called it a win. If they survived, they became local legends. If they didn't, well, there were always more rats. The strange prestige of pest control. Oddly enough, catching rats could be profitable, especially in towns where grain stores mattered more than hygiene. Cities hired official rat catchers, men paid to protect the public food supply. London, Paris, and Nuremberg all had them. The job came with a badge, a license, and the faint hope that you wouldn't die doing it. In some places, catchers even put on public shows, demonstrating their skills for curious crowds. Think of it as medieval pest control theater. Children loved it. Adults pretended not to. And, of course, someone always shouted, "Do the one with the ferret." Lotion bottle rat catchers and their secret weapons. Poisons existed, though most were unreliable or fatal to everything except rats. Early mixtures included arsenic, mercury, and ground glass. All brilliant ways to solve your rat problem and accidentally murder your neighbors. So most catchers preferred mechanical traps or smoke. Some burned rosemary or juniper to suffocate rats in burrows. Others filled holes with boiling water or something called rat paste, which was, well, best left undescribed before bedtime. Let's just say it wasn't vegan. Adult artist palette rat catchers in art and folklore. Medieval manuscripts occasionally show rat catchers, often tucked in the margins, doing battle with exaggerated beasts that look more like dragons than rodents. They wear patched cloaks, carry long sticks, and always look slightly miserable. Which, to be fair, was an accurate depiction. They were also the subject of tavern songs, little folk tunes warning about greed, disease, or marriage, often comparing one's in-laws to untrappable rats. Charming, really. The irony of the trade. The cruel twist was that many rat catchers died from the very diseases they helped contain. The same fleas, the same bites, the same air. Their work was an act of quiet martyrdom, performed for coins, not glory. Yet their labor saved harvests, kept families fed, and, at least occasionally, prevented cities from collapsing into total pestilential chaos. In their small, grim way, they were public servants. Just not the kind anyone wanted to shake hands with. Candle nights end in the alley. Picture our rat catcher now. It's near dawn. The sky is pale gray. He's walking home through the empty street, his bag full, his boots muddy. The church bells toll, and somewhere behind a shutter, someone whispers a prayer, not for him, but for the plague to pass. He doesn't mind. He knows his place in the order of things. Not noble. Not saint. Just necessary. When he gets home, he'll hang his traps by the fire. Count his coins. Drink something cheap and strong. And tomorrow, when the scratching starts again, he'll go back out. Because someone has to. Studio microphone, thanks for wandering through the darker corners of medieval life with me tonight. If you're still awake, impressive. If you've drifted off already, well, that's kind of the point. Subscribe for more sleepy journeys through the weird, weary wonders of history. Until next time, sleep well, and maybe check under your bed. Just in case. Imagine that. Crawling through a cellar, in the dark, grabbing squirming bundles of fur and teeth with bare fingers. All for a few coins. And occasionally, a case of the plague. A questionable reputation. The life of a rat catcher was complicated. They were essential, but also avoided. People needed them, but didn't really want to see them. They smelled like their work. They handled death, disease, and filth for a living. Which made them both useful and vaguely unholy. The same people who paid them might also refuse to share a table with them. Or accuse them of witchcraft, because anyone who could control vermin must be in league with something unpleasant. In Germany, a few even became folk heroes, half sorcerer, half saint. You might know the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a brightly dressed rat catcher who, after being underpaid, took a rather dark approach to debt collection. In the real world, the job wasn't quite that theatrical. No music, no magic flute. Just one exhausted man with a stick and a bag, trying to stay ahead of the next infestation. Cough in the plague years. When the Black Death arrived, rat catchers suddenly found themselves in grim demand. They couldn't cure anything, but they looked like they could help. And when half your village is coughing blood, anyone with a solution, no matter how unsanitary, seems like a good idea. Some tried fumigation, burning herbs and sulfur to chase away bad air. Others brought cats by the dozen. A few just set the whole building on fire and called it a win. If they survived, they became local legends. If they didn't, well, there were always more rats. The strange prestige of pest control. Oddly enough, catching rats could be profitable, especially in towns where grain stores mattered more than hygiene. Cities hired official rat catchers, men paid to protect the public food supply. London, Paris, and Nuremberg all had them. The job came with a badge, a license, and the faint hope that you wouldn't die doing it. In some places, catchers even put on public shows, demonstrating their skills for curious crowds. Think of it as medieval pest control theater. Children loved it. Adults pretended not to. And, of course, someone always shouted, "Do the one with the ferret." Lotion bottle rat catchers and their secret weapons. Poisons existed, though most were unreliable or fatal to everything except rats. Early mixtures included arsenic, mercury, and ground glass. All brilliant ways to solve your rat problem and accidentally murder your neighbors. So most catchers preferred mechanical traps or smoke. Some burn rosemary or juniper to suffocate rats in burrows. Others filled holes with boiling water or something called rat paste, which was, well, best left undescribed before bedtime. Let's just say it wasn't vegan. Adult artist palette rat catchers in art and folklore. Medieval manuscripts occasionally show rat catchers, often tucked in the margins, doing battle with exaggerated beasts that look more like dragons than rodents. They wear patched cloaks, carry long sticks, and always look slightly miserable. Which, to be fair, was an accurate depiction. They were also the subject of tavern songs, little folk tunes warning about greed, disease, or marriage, often comparing one's in-laws to untrappable rats. Charming, really. The irony of the trade. The cruel twist was that many rat catchers died from the very diseases they helped contain. The same fleas, the same bites, the same air. Their work was an act of quiet martyrdom, performed for coins, not glory. Yet their labor saved harvests, kept families fed, and, at least occasionally, prevented cities from collapsing into total pestilential chaos. In their small, grim way, they were public servants. Just not the kind anyone wanted to shake hands with. Candle nights end in the alley. Picture our rat catcher now. It's near dawn. The sky is pale gray. He's walking home through the empty street, his bag full, his boots muddy. The church bells toll, and somewhere behind a shutter, someone whispers a prayer, not for him, but for the plague to pass. He doesn't mind. He knows his place in the order of things. Not noble. Not saint. Just necessary. When he gets home, he'll hang his traps by the fire. Count his coins. Drink something cheap and strong. And tomorrow, when the scratching starts again, he'll go back out. Because someone has to. Studio microphone, thanks for wandering through the darker corners of medieval life with me tonight. If you're still awake, impressive. If you've drifted off already, well, that's kind of the point. Subscribe for more sleepy journeys through the weird, weary wonders of history. Until next time, sleep well, and maybe check under your bed. Just in case. Hey everyone. Welcome back. Tonight, we're heading further down the narrow alleys of medieval life, the kind of alleys that smell faintly of vinegar, ash, and things better left unnamed. We're following the rat catchers again, but this time not to the streets, to the secret world beneath them. A world of guilds, codes, and curious rituals. So, settle in, slow your breathing, and let's drift quietly into the shadows where the pest catchers kept their secrets. Candle the unseen society. Medieval Europe loved its guilds. There was a guild for everything: bakers, weavers, masons, candle makers, even professional mourners. If you could make it, mend it, or profit from it, there was probably a guild behind it, complete with rules, patron saints, and an unhealthy obsession with ceremonial hats. And yes, even the humble rat catcher had his own kind of brotherhood. Not official in the eyes of the crown, of course. More unofficial. Whispered. Half joke, half superstition. A loose fellowship of those who worked in the shadows, men, and occasionally women, who understood the ways of vermin better than the priests or physicians ever could. Rat, the Brotherhood of Vermin. The Brotherhood of Rat Catchers, as later folklore called it, wasn't really a centralized organization. It was more like a scattered network of practical magicians, folk healers, and unlucky men who spent too much time underground. They traded tips on poisons, charms, and traps. They swapped secrets about which herbs drove rats mad, which scents drew them out, and which words, supposedly, could make them freeze. Yes, you heard that right. Some believed rat catchers could speak to their prey. They called it rat speech. Not a language, exactly, more a series of hisses, whistles, and low sounds imitating the noises rats made to warn or summon one another. To outsiders, it sounded like nonsense. But to a practiced catcher, it was part of the ritual, part prayer, part performance. And perhaps, part survival. Crystal ball of charms and rat magic. Because rats seemed unstoppable, many pest catchers leaned into the supernatural for help. They carried charms, bits of fur, carved bones, coins stamped with strange symbols. In parts of France and Bohemia, they'd whisper short blessings over the traps. In Christ's name, let the teeth of hunger be still. Elsewhere, the words were less holy. Invocations to the Grey King or the Small Devil, spirits said to rule over rats and grant favor to those who pleased them. Naturally, the church disapproved. But since exorcisms didn't do much for infestations, most priests learned to look the other way. Spiderweb: the oath of silence. Some sources mention that aspiring rat catchers took informal oaths when joining their local brotherhoods. A promise never to reveal the secrets of catching or calling. Breaking that vow was considered dangerous, not just professionally, but spiritually. Because, as one 16th-century German pamphlet warned ominously, he who reveals the words of the rats will die as one. It's probably metaphorical. Probably. Still, it gave the trade a strange air of mystique. Even centuries later, people remembered rat catchers not just as workers, but as men who knew something the rest of us shouldn't. The tools of the trade. Guild or not, every serious pest controller had his own distinctive toolkit, and sometimes, his own mark. A small carving on a handle. A bit of twine tied in a special knot. Even the way they carried their traps became a kind of signature. It wasn't vanity, it was necessity. The trade was competitive, and in big towns, rival catchers sometimes sabotaged each other's work. If a trap failed or went missing, the craftsman needed to prove it was his. So, like artists, they signed their work, only their art was dead rats. Lotion bottle trade secrets, and a bit of dishonesty. Rat catchers were famous for selling their miracle tonics, bottles of pungent mystery liquid said to repel vermin. Some might actually have worked, usually based on herbs like rue or wormwood. Others were mixtures of vinegar, spoiled ale, and optimism. But the real trick wasn't the formula, it was the show. A good rat catcher could convince a whole market square that his brew was blessed by Saint Gertrude herself, patron saint of cats and cleanliness. He'd pour a bit on the ground, whistle, and lo and behold, the rats would scatter. Of course, that might have been because he'd just poured vinegar near their nest. But no one wanted to ruin the magic. Candle rituals of the road. Because the job meant traveling constantly, from town to town, from plague to plague, the pest catchers developed small rituals for luck. They'd spit 3 times before entering a new house. They'd never step on a dead rat's tail, a sure sign of bad luck. And if they caught a white rat, they'd release it immediately, believing it to be a spirit rat, the guardian of its kind. Superstition blended with survival, as it often did in the Middle Ages. When the line between faith and folklore is blurred, you cling to whatever makes sense in the dark. Scroll rat catchers in the record books. We actually have a few names that survived. Hans the Ratter of Hamburg, 1478, paid by the city to clear its docks. Peter van Brugge, Antwerp, 1523, known for his tame ferrets and habit of wearing a necklace made of rat tails. Yes. A necklace. A fashion statement no one asked for. They appear in dusty civic ledgers, paid in silver pennies for their services, sometimes rewarded with food or lodgings, rarely with thanks. Balanced scale between faith and filth. Their work existed in a strange moral limbo. Holy men blessed the fields, kings commanded armies, but it was the rat catchers who kept the granaries from ruin. They didn't fight for glory or God. They fought for grain. And yet, because they dealt with death, they were never quite respectable. Always a little too close to the underworld, both literal and metaphorical. In a way, they were mirrors of the world they lived in, poor, practical, superstitious, and oddly heroic. Waxing crescent moon closing the circle. By the time the Renaissance rolled in, the brotherhood of rat catchers had mostly dissolved, absorbed into the growing city bureaucracies that handled public hygiene. Their secrets faded. Their oaths forgotten. Their tools replaced by chemicals and paperwork. But somewhere, in the quiet archives of old European towns, you can still find their names. Scrawled in ink, marked with smudges, listed as rat men, Mauser, catcher. Ordinary names. Extraordinary endurance. They lived in the margins, and fittingly, that's where they're remembered. Studio microphone, thanks for joining me again tonight, as we wandered through the hidden brotherhoods of medieval pest control. If you're still awake, congratulations, you're tougher than most medieval townsfolk facing a cellar full of rats. And if you're already drifting off, may your dreams be blissfully free of squeaking. Subscribe for more sleepy history, and we'll meet again in the next quiet corner of the past. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, impressive. Tonight, we're slipping deeper into the medieval alleys, where the flicker of lanterns meets the soft scurrying of paws. And yes, that's never a good sign. So, settle in again. Let the room grow dim, the air grow still, and let's talk about one of history's most questionable job markets, rat catching in the age of the plague. Because while most people were praying not to die horribly, someone, somewhere, was quietly saying, I can make a living off this. It began, as so many medieval disasters did, with ships. They brought spices. They brought silk. And they brought fleas. The rats were just the delivery service, soft, beady-eyed couriers carrying one of history's most efficient death systems, Yersinia pestis. By the mid-1300s, cities from London to Lubeck were little more than whispering chambers of dread. Bells tolled constantly. Priests hurried through the streets muttering prayers at a safe distance. And yet, the rats continued to thrive. Because of course they did. They had everything they needed, food scraps, fear, and people too scared to clean up. This, naturally, created demand. Enter the rat catcher. Armed with traps, dogs, and a collection of very questionable potions, these were the people who thrived in the margins of catastrophe. A rat catcher could make the equivalent of a craftsman's wage, assuming he didn't die first. They'd boast about their methods, of course. Guaranteed pest removal, they'd say, as though rats weren't already guaranteed to return the moment you blinked. Some used ferrets, small and nimble. Some relied on dogs, wiry terriers that became beloved, if slightly traumatized, companions. Others used poison. Often homemade. Often containing things you should never, ever touch with your bare hands. Mercury, arsenic, or whatever looked scientific enough to sell to a nervous town council. It wasn't glamorous. Rat catchers were both needed and despised, like plumbers of pestilence. You might see one trudging through town with a sack twitching at the edges, earning disgusted stares. But when the scratching in the cellar began again at midnight, suddenly, the rat catcher's knock was welcome. There was even a hierarchy. The elite rat men of royal courts claimed to protect castles from infestation. One German noble reportedly employed his own personal rattenfänger, complete with livery and a small silver badge shaped like a rat. Because of course the nobility would turn pest control into a symbol of status. Now, you might imagine they worked quietly and efficiently. But this was the Middle Ages. So naturally, they made it weird. Many rat catchers moonlighted as street performers. They'd stand in the marketplace, pulling live rats from traps to demonstrate their skill. Or display piles of corpses as proof of service rendered, like an early Yelp review, but with tails. Children found it fascinating. Adults found it nauseating. And both threw coins. Others dabbled in superstition. If you burned the whiskers of a freshly caught rat and scattered the ashes in front of your home, they said, other rats would avoid it. If you hung a dead rat by its tail in the doorway, that apparently worked too, though one imagines the neighbors were less than thrilled. Let's drift, now, to the city of Lübeck, one of the Hanseatic ports of northern Germany. Here, records mention entire guilds of rat catchers, semi-officially recognized. They were paid in coin, bread, and occasionally beer, because no job was too grim for medieval Europe to skip the alcohol. During plague outbreaks, many fled the city. But not the rat catchers. They stayed. Not because they were brave, necessarily, but because they were broke. And so, while the wealthier citizens sealed themselves behind heavy doors, rat catchers crept through the empty markets at night, their footsteps echoing against shuttered stalls. It was said that in those days, you could hear the sound of rats beneath the church floors, a living carpet of survival. Of course, the irony here is cruelly simple. They were fighting the plague by handling the very creatures that spread it. Most didn't last long. But the ones who did became almost legendary, seen as immune, or perhaps blessed by some dark charm. A few even marketed themselves as plague experts. They sold tonics, charms, and powders that promised to drive away the pestilence. None of it worked. But that didn't matter. When death is everywhere, logic isn't. By the 15th century, the rat catcher had become a fixture of European towns. There were even ballads written about them, half admiration, half mockery. And yes, this is where the story begins to shift towards something that sounds familiar, the legend of the Pied Piper. We'll drift into that next. The strange blend of pest control, music, and myth that turned one grim profession into a fairy tale about loss and betrayal. But for now, take a breath. Imagine the quiet medieval street. The flicker of a lantern. The faint rattle of a cage. And the soft, rhythmic scurry of tiny feet beneath the floorboards, history's most persistent background noise. Hey everyone. If you're still with me, and not blissfully asleep yet, we're gliding tonight into one of those half-remembered corners of medieval folklore. A story about rats, children, and a man in very suspiciously bright clothing. Yes, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. A tale you probably heard as a child, cheerful music, a mysterious flute, and a town that learned a very expensive lesson about paying its contractors. But beneath the fairy tale is something colder. Something almost bureaucratically tragic. Because, as it turns out, this whimsical bedtime story may have started as a medieval invoice that went unpaid. Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere around 1284. The place, Hamelin, a modest town tucked in the green folds of Lower Saxony. Narrow lanes, half-timbered houses, a marketplace that smelled faintly of beer, cheese, and mild despair. And then, the rats came. Of course they did. They always came. They squeezed through granaries, burrowed beneath bakeries, and even turned churchyards into their own rodent subdivisions. The townspeople tried everything: traps, dogs, curses, and, when that failed, prayer. As usual, prayer didn't seem to bother the rats much. Then one day, a stranger appeared. He wore a long, multicolored coat, pied meant patched or striped, and carried a small flute. He claimed he could rid the town of its rat problem. The people, half desperate and wholly gullible, agreed to pay him a handsome sum if he succeeded. And succeed he did. According to the tale, he played his pipe, and the rats, entranced, followed him out of the city, down to the river Weser, and drowned. A miracle, said the townsfolk. Until it was time to pay. And then, suddenly, the miracle was not legally binding. The piper demanded his payment. The town council refused. They quibbled, as councils tend to do. Times are hard, they said. Budgets are tight. So, the piper left. But he came back. This time, he played again, but not for rats. The music wound through the streets like a spell, soft and strange. And as it passed, the children of Hamelin, 130 of them, according to one account, followed him out of the gates. Down the same path as the rats. And they never returned. Now, depending on which version you hear, the children drowned, were sealed in a cave, or simply vanished. It's the kind of story that lingers in folklore because it feels like it could have happened. Not in the magical sense, but in that grim, plausible medieval way where everything went slightly wrong all the time. And here's the strange part. There really is a record in Hamelin's own town chronicle. It mentions, quite soberly, that in the year 1284, on the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children of Hamelin were lost. No mention of rats. No mention of music. Just that word, lost. It's chilling in its simplicity. And, naturally, historians have spent centuries trying to explain it. Some say it was a plague, that the children were victims of disease, and the piper was a symbol of death itself. Others think it was emigration, that the children were young people led away by a recruiter, perhaps to settle new lands in Eastern Europe. And the music? Maybe just a poetic flourish that grew with retelling. There's even a theory that the story reflects a tragic landslide, or that Piper referred to a local surname, not an instrument at all. But the most likely truth is somewhere murky, as truths often are. Maybe it was all of these things: loss, confusion, and the quiet ache of a town that needed a story to make sense of its grief. Still, the image of the piper endured, that eerie, colorful figure leading the children into silence. It became a kind of moral warning about promises and debts. Pay what you owe, the story whispers. Or else something dear will be taken from you. In a way, it's the medieval version of a Google review. Just, with more flutes and fewer survivors. By the 16th century, the tale had spread across Europe. Artists painted it, poets romanticized it, and moralists twisted it into sermons. The rats were added somewhere along the way, probably by later storytellers who thought kidnapping sounded a bit grim for bedtime. So, they turned it into a more family-friendly allegory about pest control. Because nothing says comfort like mass rodent drowning. Let's drift, now, to the strange legacy it left behind. In Hamelin today, you can walk the Bungelosenstrasse, the street without drums. By tradition, no music is played there. Out of respect. The church still has a stained glass window from around 1300, showing the piper in his bright clothes, leading away small, pale figures. Every summer, actors in costume reenact the story, cheerful, musical, and ever so slightly uneasy. Because everyone knows, deep down, that it wasn't just a fairy tale. It was a whisper of loss, wrapped in rhythm, disguised as a song. And the irony, of course, is that it all began with rats. That small, scrabbling problem that turned into legend. A profession born from pestilence, immortalized in myth, and still echoing down the centuries, softly, like the fading notes of a flute under moonlight. Hey everyone. If you're still here, still half awake, maybe with the glow of your screen soft against the dark, good. Because tonight, we're going to wander into one of the most quietly absurd corners of medieval thought. The place where science, religion, and pest control all met, and promptly had an argument. This is the story of how medieval Europe tried, earnestly and often disastrously, to outthink the rat. By the late Middle Ages, after centuries of plague and pestilence, people began to wonder. What if the problem wasn't the rats? What if it was the air? And so began one of history's most well-intentioned misunderstandings, miasma theory. According to this logic, disease wasn't caused by germs, those hadn't been invented yet, but by bad air. Foul vapors. Invisible clouds of decay. If you could smell it, it could kill you. Which, to be fair, was occasionally true. But not for the reasons they thought. This theory gave birth to a whole industry of smells, pleasant ones, mostly. Doctors stuffed their masks with herbs and flowers. Homes were fumigated with sage, rosemary, and occasionally gunpowder, which solved the smell problem by removing the home. There were even rat candles, sticks of wax laced with sulfur and crushed sage, said to drive rodents away through pure moral disapproval. One chronicler wrote that rats abhor the odor of virtue. Though, to be honest, rats never struck anyone as the moral type. Then came the alchemists. Ah yes, the thinkers who believed that by mixing mercury, lead, and enough hubris, they could unlock the secrets of the universe. Naturally, they also believed they could invent the perfect rat poison. They'd sit hunched over brass cauldrons, stirring mysterious concoctions, labeling them things like Spiritus rodentis or essence of vermin's doom. In reality, most of these mixtures did little more than produce dramatic smoke and mild headaches. But people bought them anyway. Because if it came in a glass vial and smelled faintly of apocalypse, it had to work. Meanwhile, the church had its own approach. If alchemy didn't stop the rats, maybe faith would. There are actual records, real, Latin manuscripts, describing rat excommunication ceremonies. Yes. Entire villages once gathered to officially banish rats from church property. A priest would stand before the congregation, solemnly reciting, "We command thee, O rats, in the name of the Almighty, to depart from this holy place and never return." Sometimes, they even gave the rats a grace period, a few days to pack their things and leave peacefully. Unsurprisingly, the rats rarely respected the deadline. And yet, for centuries, this remained a legitimate legal ritual. Because nothing says spiritual authority like threatening rodents with eternal damnation. Monks, on the other hand, had a slightly more practical touch. In monastic gardens, they experimented with herbs, not just for healing, but for pest control. They discovered that mint and pennyroyal deterred mice. They brewed wormwood water, believing it would keep fleas at bay. They even trained cats, though, as anyone who's ever met a cat knows, this worked only when the cat felt like it. Still, it was the closest thing to actual science happening in the 14th century. Trial, error, and mild exasperation. Now, here's where it gets oddly poetic. The rats, for all their filth and menace, became a sort of mirror, reflecting human persistence. Every trap, every potion, every prayer was a small defiance against chaos. And in a world that seemed constantly on the edge of ruin, that mattered. So even as cities crumbled and people whispered of curses, there was always someone out there, setting another trap, lighting another candle, or waving another vial of anti-vermin elixir. It didn't really work. But it kept them busy, and sometimes, that's enough to keep despair from setting in. By the 16th century, the science of pest control had begun to shift. Rats were no longer viewed as supernatural agents but as physical nuisances, which was progress, by medieval standards. Street cleaners were hired. Sewers were expanded. And city ordinances began to mention things like waste removal and drain maintenance, which, in medieval Europe, was basically revolutionary thinking. And yet, even with all the advancements, the rats persisted. They survived every purge, every poison, every prayer. They thrived in castles and hovels alike, indifferent to human ambition. In a way, they were the great equalizers of the age, gnawing through the foundations of kings and commoners with perfect, democratic indifference. So as we drift away from this strange chapter of history, picture it. A smoky chamber filled with the scent of burning sage. A hooded alchemist whispering Latin over a bubbling flask. A monk scolding a rat like a wayward novice. And outside, the night hums softly, alive with the sound of tiny feet. Because even when humanity tried to master nature, nature still won. Quietly. Patiently. And with whiskers. Hey everyone. Still here? Good. Because what comes next is one of those rare chapters where medieval Europe outdoes itself. We've talked about superstition, plague, and potions. But tonight, let's slip quietly into the candlelit courtroom, where justice, somehow, was extended to animals. Yes. The Middle Ages truly put everything on trial. And I mean everything. Let's start in Autun, France, in the year 1522. A local court convened to hear a most unusual case. The townspeople had accused the rats of stealing and destroying their grain stores. The defendants, being rats, didn't show up. Which, frankly, feels like a sound legal strategy. But the court, ever procedural, didn't see it that way. A lawyer was appointed to defend the rats. His name was Bartholomew Chassonneur, and he would go on to become a famous jurist, because of course he would. He argued that his clients could not safely appear in court, because the roads were filled with their natural predators, namely cats. Therefore, he said, the rats required safe conduct to attend. And the court, wonderfully, agreed to consider it. Now, imagine it. A solemn hall. Wooden benches. Wax dripping from chandeliers. And a group of learned men debating whether a colony of rats had the right to a fair and cat-free trial. This is not parody. It actually happened. It is one of the best documented examples of animal trials, a legal phenomenon that lasted for centuries. Rats, pigs, dogs, even grasshoppers and leeches were summoned to court, charged with crimes ranging from theft to murder to, in one tragic case, property damage by infestation. Because apparently, medieval Europe's motto was, if it exists, we can sue it. The logic was rooted in theology. Everything that existed was part of God's order, and therefore under divine law. So if a creature misbehaved, say, ate your crops or chewed through your church tapestries, it wasn't merely a nuisance. It was a moral offense. You couldn't just kill it, you had to sentence it. Publicly. Properly. Legally. In one case, a pig was executed for homicide. In another, a rooster was burned at the stake for laying an egg, which, apparently, was considered satanic. And yes, the egg was also burned, just in case it hatched into something improperly diabolical. Because, naturally, you can't be too careful with poultry sorcery. But back to the rats. Their lawyer, Chassaigneur, continued to defend them brilliantly. He argued that since the rats were spread across multiple parishes, it was unreasonable to expect them all to hear the summons. And besides, he added, the rats' very nature made them timid. If they failed to appear, it was not out of contempt for the court, but out of a reasonable fear for their safety. You can almost picture him, standing there, robes immaculate, expression grave, sincerely defending a population of rodents with more dignity than most human defendants ever received. The trial, naturally, went nowhere. The rats were never seen in court. And after much deliberation, the case was quietly dropped. The grain remained missing. The rats remained at large. Justice, as always, was inconclusive. But Chassaigneurs' reputation soared. He became known as the lawyer who spoke for the voiceless, quite literally. He later wrote an influential book on legal procedure, which somehow did not include a chapter on rodent clients. Still, his performance left a mark. It set a precedent for how seriously these trials were taken. Because in the strange mind of the Middle Ages, even chaos had to be neatly filed under due process. Let's drift now to another kind of trial, one not against individual animals, but against entire species. When swarms of locusts or caterpillars devastated crops, the church would step in. Bishops and priests would issue formal excommunication orders against them. An entire ceremony might unfold. Candles lit. Bells rung. A proclamation read aloud in Latin. We hereby banish these creatures from the vineyards and fields, commanding them, under pain of curse, to depart these lands within 6 days. 6 days. Generous, considering their wings. If the insects didn't comply, and they rarely did, the church declared them heretical, invoking saints to smite them. And while nothing changed, people found comfort in the formality of it. Because when the world feels uncontrollable, rules, even absurd ones, feel like control. Over time, these trials faded. The Renaissance brought new science, and with it, new priorities. Rats were no longer defendants, they were data points. Insects were cataloged, not cursed. And the courtrooms grew quieter. But part of me thinks, in some small, sleepy way, that there's something oddly tender about it. These people looked at the world around them, chaotic, unfair, full of suffering, and believed even a rat deserved its day in court. A strange kind of justice, yes. But also, a kind of mercy. In a world ruled by fate and plague, fairness, however misplaced, was still a comfort. So, as the candles burn low in that long-forgotten courtroom, picture the scene one last time. The judge in his robes. The clerk scratching notes on parchment. And the lawyer for the defense, standing tall, arguing eloquently for creatures that never knew they'd been accused. Somewhere outside, a rat scurries past the courthouse wall. Completely innocent. Completely guilty. Completely free. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, you're doing better than most courtiers did after dinner in the 15th century. Tonight, we're tiptoeing into the quieter, dustier corners of palaces, places where the rats were just as noble as the residents, and the men hired to remove them were treated almost like gentlemen. Yes. The royal rat catchers. Because if there's one thing medieval and early modern kings couldn't stand, besides assassination attempts in bad Latin, it was being upstaged by rodents. Let's start with the French court, where, naturally, even vermin control had to be fashionable. By the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, Versailles was a place of marble, gold, and mice. lots of them. Beneath the gleaming halls, an entire population of rats feasted on the leftovers of royal banquets. So the palace employed specialists known as chasseurs de rats, rat hunters, who wore official livery, carried traps engraved with fleur-de-lis, and had full access to royal kitchens. They even had an unofficial hierarchy. Senior rat catchers managed teams. Junior ones were assigned to the stables or servants' quarters. And the most elite were trusted with the dining halls, because nothing said prestige like catching a rat in front of a duke and pretending it was all very routine. At the English court, things were even more theatrical. Records from the Tudor and Stuart periods mention official titles like King's Rat Catcher and Royal Mole Taker. Yes, mole taker. Because apparently, the royal lawns needed defending too. One famous name in the trade was Jack Black, who served under Queen Victoria centuries later, but his profession stretched back to medieval roots. He wore a scarlet waistcoat, a tall hat, and a belt covered in dead rats, which, depending on your standards, was either very metal or very unhygienic. He'd display his catch like trophies and sell the live ones to laboratories or, disturbingly, to pet enthusiasts. Some were even dressed up and paraded for entertainment, because nothing says Victorian leisure quite like accessorized vermin. But back in the medieval period, rat catching was oddly political. Being the royal rat catcher meant access to the palace, and therefore, information. Servants talked. Courtiers gossiped. And while others schemed for land or influence, the rat catcher overheard everything. He could wander into any chamber under the noble excuse of investigating an infestation. Some of them became informal messengers. Some were spies. And a few were reportedly blackmailers, holding secrets as neatly as they held traps. Because power, like rats, always finds the smallest holes to slip through. It wasn't all intrigue and satin, of course. The job was dangerous. Poison handling was common, arsenic, mercury, and even powdered glass were used liberally. And despite the prestige, the pay was modest. A royal rat catcher might earn enough for bread and ale, but not enough for silk. Still, there was status in being of the household. Your name might appear in royal accounts, nestled between laundresses and falconers. For a common man, that meant everything. It meant protection. A pension. A warm place to sleep, hopefully rat-free. In some courts, the line between rat catcher and entertainer blurred. During banquets, these men might demonstrate their skill for amusement, releasing a few live rats and letting their trained dogs or ferrets hunt them before an applauding audience. It was grotesque, yes. But to a medieval noble, it was sport, a reminder that even chaos could be controlled, tamed, and conquered for pleasure. It was all performance. A dance of death for creatures too small to protest. Now, one of the strangest royal traditions came from Habsburg Austria, where a few noble households reportedly kept trained rats as curiosities, intelligent, nimble, almost affectionate. The line between pest and pet blurred. A visiting scholar once remarked that he'd seen a rat in a collar of silver, kept by a baron for conversation. Which, if true, may explain quite a lot about the Habsburgs in general. Meanwhile, in Russia, rat catchers at the Tsar's palace were known as chrysolovi, literally rat hunters. They were provided quarters near the kitchens and tasked with protecting not just food stores but royal furs, because nothing ruined ermine like tiny teeth. These men used smoke, traps, and sometimes cats, though Russian cats, as one court report noted, had a habit of falling asleep on duty. The rat catchers, however, did not. They prowled the halls at night, their lanterns casting long, shaky shadows, a quiet war fought beneath chandeliers. Over time, as pest control grew more professional, the mystique faded. By the 18th century, the royal rat catcher was less of a character and more of a tradesman. The job still existed, but without the glamour or the gossip. Science had caught up. Traps improved. Poisons became standardized. And the courts grew cleaner, mostly. But every now and then, a record surfaces, a small note in an archive, listing payment to the rat man of His Majesty. A faint echo of a world where even vermin removal had ceremony. Because in the end, that's what medieval life was all about. Turning necessity into ritual. Even if that ritual involved chasing rodents under royal tables. So, as we leave the glittering halls behind, imagine the sound, faint footsteps in the dark, the scrape of wood, the click of a trap. Somewhere beneath the music and perfume, history scurries quietly on, unseen, but always present. Just like the rats. Hey everyone. If you're still with me, congratulations, you've outlasted most medieval banquets. Tonight, we're moving from the shadows of the royal kitchens into something far pettier, the politics of cleanliness. Because in the Middle Ages and well beyond, filth wasn't just unhygienic, it was scandalous. And nothing ruined a noble reputation faster than being accused of living among rats. You see, to modern ears, it might sound almost trivial. But back then, cleanliness wasn't a personal virtue. It was a symbol of divine favor, good breeding, and, most importantly, power. If your castle was spotless, it meant your rule was blessed. If it stank, well, perhaps God was trying to tell everyone something. So naturally, royal rivals began to use rats as insults. Literally. Letters, pamphlets, and court gossip would whisper. Did you hear? The Duke's Hall is crawling with vermin. It was less about actual rodents and more about what they implied: decay, neglect, corruption. Rats became a metaphor for everything wrong with a noble soul. Which, in fairness, was often quite a lot. Let's drift back to 14th century France for a moment. The 100 Years' War was raging, kings were frequently broke, and the court of Charles VI, the one who occasionally thought he was made of glass, was a mess. His rivals in Burgundy spread rumors that the royal kitchens were infested, the cellars overrun. Now, did anyone actually see a rat? Probably not. But the gossip worked. Because the idea that God's anointed king couldn't even control mice made him sound both weak and cursed. Medieval politics was never subtle. In England, things were even more performative. During the Wars of the Roses, propaganda leaflets accused opposing nobles of being gnawed by vermin, spiritually, of course, and corrupted in their own houses. It was the 15th century equivalent of a very pointed tweet. A way to say, your house is literally rotten, without having to show evidence. Even later, during Henry VIII's reign, one courtier described an enemy as the rat of Lincoln's Inn, known to chew through purse strings. A poetic way to call someone a thief, and, apparently, a rodent. The church joined in, too. In the 13th century, several monastic records mention divine punishment by rats, entire abbeys said to have been overtaken after their abbots grew greedy or prideful. It's hard to tell how literal these stories were. But in sermons, preachers used the image often, a warning that sin brings decay. The rat was not just a pest, it was a parable with whiskers. By the Renaissance, rat imagery became more visual. Political cartoons in early modern Europe sometimes depicted corrupt ministers as rats scurrying from sinking ships or gnawing on coins. Even today, we say rat for a betrayer. That association of treachery, filth, and opportunism comes straight from those centuries of symbolism. Which is impressive branding, really. For an animal that never asked for a publicist. And yet, irony of ironies, the palaces that mocked their rivals for dirt were themselves crawling with creatures. Take Versailles. Under all that gold leaf and perfume, the walls were alive. Mice darted through corridors. Fleas and lice thrived in powdered wigs. Servants swept daily, but there was only so much one could do when the plumbing consisted of buckets and optimism. Foreign ambassadors noted the smell discreetly in their diaries. But never aloud, of course. You didn't mention the rats at Versailles, not unless you wanted to disappear into a very clean, very discreet oubliette. Meanwhile, in the German states, rival courts often sent dirty gifts. No, really. A few diplomatic letters mention sending baskets of spoiled grain or tainted wine, not as literal poison, but as metaphorical insults. The recipient would understand the meaning: you live like a rat. It was subtle, petty, and perfectly European. Perhaps the most ironic episode came during the reign of Louis XV. While critics accused the monarchy of decadence, the Palace of Versailles itself began to suffer serious rat infestations. At one point, a whole nest was discovered beneath the Hall of Mirrors. Rather than admit to it, the palace officials had it quietly removed at night, by candlelight, so that not even servants could gossip. Because if word got out that the palace of the Sun King's descendant was swarming with rats, it would be more damaging than any war. And then, of course, came the revolution. When the French pamphleteers began portraying the nobility as bloated rats feasting on the people's bread, the metaphor became literal again. Purge the palace of vermin, they wrote, meaning, of course, the aristocracy. The imagery stuck. To this day, when someone says a government is infested with rats, they probably don't mean actual rodents. They're echoing propaganda that's over 200 years old. So yes, in a very odd way, rats helped topple monarchies. They became the ultimate political insult, small, dirty, and hard to get rid of. By the 19th century, the metaphor had spread everywhere. Cartoonists drew industrialists as rats. Workers were told to root out the vermin of greed. And ironically, as science began to understand diseases and sanitation, the symbolism only grew stronger. Now we knew rats carried plague, which made them perfect scapegoats for everything else that went wrong. The politics of filth became the politics of fear. And once again, the humble rat was caught in the middle, just trying to mind its business and steal a crumb of bread. So tonight, if you ever see a small shadow skitter by your wall, don't worry. It's not a judgment on your housekeeping. It's simply history, running past. The same history that whispered in the halls of kings, that embarrassed nobles, and toppled crowns. Rats, after all, never cared who ruled the castle. They only cared about the crumbs.